The crystal chandelier sparkled overhead as Sandra Bullock quietly slipped into Bellini's, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive restaurants. Dressed in simple jeans and a casual blazer with minimal makeup, she wasn't trying to draw attention, just hoping to enjoy a peaceful dinner after a long day of filming. What should have been a pleasant evening was about to become an incident that would ripple through Hollywood and beyond. "Excuse me, I believe I have a reservation," Sandra said softly to the host, who immediately recognized her and beamed with professional courtesy. "Of course, Ms. Bullock." "Right this way," the host replied, leading her to a secluded corner table. That's when Thomas entered the picture. A waiter in his late 20s, with slicked back hair and an air of superiority that seemed out of place even in this upscale establishment. As the host departed, Thomas approached the table with visible annoyance, barely making eye contact. "Water?" he asked curtly, without any greeting or acknowledgement of who she was. "Yes, please. And maybe a few more minutes with the menu?" Sandra responded with her characteristic warmth. Thomas sighed audibly, rolling his eyes. "Look, we're extremely busy tonight. I have actual important customers waiting. I can't spend all evening on one table just because you want to take your time." The restaurant wasn't particularly full, making his rudeness all the more perplexing. A few nearby diners glanced over, recognizing the famous actress and appearing shocked at how she was being treated. "I understand. I'll be quick," Sandra replied, attempting to defuse the situation. When Thomas returned 10 minutes later, his behavior only worsened. He hovered impatiently as she ordered, interrupted her mid-sentence, and then loudly repeated her order as if speaking to someone hard of hearing. "One house salad, and no dressing, and the plain grilled chicken. Nothing fancy for you, huh?" He emphasized each word mockingly. Are celebrities watching their figures these days, or just being difficult? The restaurant had fallen uncomfortably quiet. Several patrons were now openly staring, some with phones partially raised. Sandra, usually composed and professional, felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Is there a problem?" she asked quietly. "The problem is people who think they're special," Thomas sneered, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Just because you've been in some movies doesn't mean you get special treatment here. This is an establishment for people who appreciate fine dining, not for celebrities looking for attention." Sandra sat stunned, her eyes downcast. The cruelty was as unexpected as it was public. The restaurant manager had noticed the commotion and was hurrying across the floor, alarm visible on his face. Across the restaurant, a man in a simple black suit had been observing the entire incident. He had been dining alone, cap pulled low over his eyes, but now he stood up. As the manager approached Sandra's table, the man intercepted him with a few quiet words. The man removed his cap, revealing himself to be Keanu Reeves. His face showed not anger, but a calm, determined resolve. He whispered something to the manager, who nodded and stepped back. Then Keanu moved toward Sandra's table, where Thomas was still standing, apparently enjoying his moment of cruelty. What happened next would leave everyone in the restaurant speechless. Keanu Reeves approached the table with the quiet confidence that had become his trademark both on and off screen. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voice, just his steady presence as he placed himself between Sandra and the hostile waiter. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice low but carrying a weight that commanded attention. "I couldn't help but overhear what's happening here." Thomas's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to sudden recognition. The restaurant had fallen so silent that the gentle clink of silverware from the kitchen seemed thunderous. "I believe everyone deserves to be treated with kindness," Keanu continued, making eye contact with Thomas. "Especially when they're just trying to enjoy a quiet meal." He didn't identify Sandra by name or status, a subtle but powerful choice that emphasized her humanity over her celebrity. Thomas stammered, You didn't recognize her," Keanu finished for him. "But that shouldn't matter. Would you speak to your mother this way? Your sister? Anyone?" The question hung in the air. Several diners nodded in agreement, and someone in the back of the restaurant began to applaud softly. I don't want to make a scene, Keanu added, turning slightly to include the watching crowd in his words. That's not why either of us came here tonight. He gestured to himself and Sandra. We're just people, trying to enjoy good food and peace, like everyone else. Sandra looked up at Keanu with grateful eyes. They had worked together years before and maintained a casual friendship, but this unexpected defense touched her deeply. The restaurant manager had been watching nervously from a few feet away. Now he stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. Mr. Reeves, Ms. Bullock, I cannot apologize enough for this incident. Please, allow me to comp your meals and assure you that this behavior does not reflect our establishment's values. Thomas stood frozen, the reality of his actions, and their potential consequences, finally sinking in. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a pallor that suggested he realized his job might be at stake. But what happened next surprised everyone. Keanu placed a gentle hand on the manager's shoulder and spoke quietly. Before any decisions are made, could we all talk privately? There might be more to this situation than we understand. The manager looked confused but nodded. Of course. We can use my office. As they began to move away from the table, Sandra stood and touched Thomas's arm, stopping him. Despite the humiliation she'd just experienced, there was no anger in her expression, only curiosity and a hint of concern. Why? She asked simply. What made you so angry at someone you don't even know? Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his serving tray. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, his voice cracked, revealing a vulnerability that contradicted his earlier behavior. The four of them, Sandra, Keanu, the manager, and Thomas, made their way through the restaurant toward the back office. The other diners watched in silence, witnessing not the dramatic confrontation they might have expected, but something far more intriguing, a moment of potential reconciliation. In the manager's office, Thomas sank into a chair, looking defeated. The bravado had completely disappeared, leaving behind what appeared to be a young man in significant distress. I should fire you on the spot, the manager began, his voice tight with controlled anger. But Keanu raised his hand slightly. Before that happens, maybe we should hear the whole story. He turned to Thomas with an expression not of judgment but of genuine interest. Something's clearly bothering you. And while it doesn't excuse how you treated Ms. Bullock, I think we'd all like to understand why. Thomas looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. What he revealed next would change the entire trajectory of the evening, connecting these three strangers in ways none of them could have anticipated. My mother is dying, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air of the small office, heavy and unexpected. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The room fell silent. Sandra and Keanu exchanged glances, while the manager's stern expression softened slightly. She's been a fan of yours since Speed, Thomas continued, looking at Sandra with eyes now brimming with tears. She watches Miss Congeniality whenever she has a bad day after chemo. I've seen it so many times I can quote whole scenes. He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. When I saw you walk in tonight, all I could think about was how my mom would never get to meet you. How unfair it all is. She's the kindest person I know, and she's dying, while the world just keeps spinning for everyone else. Sandra moved closer, her own eyes reflecting compassion that belied the treatment she'd received moments earlier. That still doesn't explain why you were so cruel, the manager said, though his tone had lost its edge. Thomas nodded, running a hand through his hair. I know. It was unforgivable. These past few months, I've been working double shifts to help with the medical bills. I barely sleep. I'm constantly terrified of losing her. His shoulders slumped. But that's no excuse. I took out my pain on someone who didn't deserve it. Keanu, who had been listening intently, spoke up. I lost my sister to leukemia, he said quietly. The simple statement carried years of understanding. The anger you feel, it needs somewhere to go. But it rarely finds the right target. The revelation created a momentary bond between the two men. Thomas looked at Keanu with new recognition, as if seeing beyond the famous face to the human experiences beneath. "Your mother, what's her name?" Sandra asked gently. "Eleanor," Thomas replied. "She's at Providence St. John's. They've been amazing, but the bills." He trailed off, the financial reality clearly another weight on his shoulders. The manager, who had been observing the conversation with growing sympathy, sighed. "Thomas, what you did on the floor tonight was completely unprofessional. Under normal circumstances, it would mean immediate termination." Thomas nodded, accepting the inevitable. "But," the manager continued, "I lost my father to cancer 3 years ago. I understand the pressure you're under." He paused, considering. "You'll be on probation. Any complaint, any issue at all, and that's it. And you'll need to take a week off, paid leave, to be with your mother and get some rest." The unexpected compassion caught Thomas off guard. "Thank you, sir. I don't deserve, everyone deserves a second chance," Keanu interjected quietly. Sandra had been thinking, her fingers lightly tapping on the desk. "What hospital did you say your mother is in?" "Providence St. John's," Thomas repeated. "Room 415. Sandra pulled out her phone and made a brief note. "I'd like to meet Eleanor, if that's all right with you." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "You would do that? After how I treated you?" Sandra smiled, the warmth reaching her eyes. "Let's just say I understand the healing power of miscongeniality in difficult times." What none of them knew in that moment was that this encounter would develop into something far more significant than a simple restaurant incident. The connections forming in that small office would lead to unexpected developments and a friendship that would touch lives far beyond their own. 3 days after the incident at Bellini's, Sandra Bullock walked through the quiet corridors of Providence St. John's Hospital, carrying a small gift bag. She found room 415 and paused at the doorway, watching the tender scene inside. Thomas sat beside his mother's bed, reading aloud from a dog-eared paperback, while Eleanor, thin but alert, listened with a gentle smile. Sandra knocked softly on the doorframe. "Is this a good time?" The look of astonishment on both their faces was immediately followed by Eleanor's gasp of recognition. Despite her frailty, her eyes lit up with unmistakable joy. "You came," Thomas said, standing awkwardly. "I wasn't sure if you meant it." "I always keep my promises," Sandra replied, approaching Eleanor's bedside. "Mrs. Eleanor, I hear you're a fan of my work." "I'm honored." Eleanor reached for Sandra's hand with trembling fingers. "Please, call me Eleanor. I can't believe you're really here. Thomas told me what happened." "He shouldn't have, Mom, please don't," Thomas interrupted, embarrassment coloring his face. "Water under the bridge," Sandra assured them both, pulling up a chair. "I brought something for you." She handed Eleanor the gift bag, which contained a personally signed script from Miss Congeniality and several behind-the-scenes Polaroids from the set. What began as a 30-minute courtesy visit extended into 2 hours of genuine conversation. Eleanor had been a drama teacher before her retirement, and her insights into Sandra's films revealed a deep understanding of the craft that impressed the actress. Thomas mostly observed in silence, witnessing his mother's transformation from patient back to the vibrant woman he feared was slipping away. As Sandra was preparing to leave, a nurse hurried in. "Ms. Eleanor, look who's back to see you again." Behind her stood Keanu Reeves, carrying an armful of daisies, Eleanor's favorite flowers, though he couldn't have known that. "You two know each other?" Thomas asked, bewildered. Keanu nodded. "I've been visiting Eleanor for about a week now. We connected through the hospital's volunteer program." The coincidence seemed almost impossible. Keanu had been randomly paired with Eleanor through a celebrity hospital visitation program days before the restaurant incident, completely unaware of her connection to Thomas. "He's been reading poetry to me," Eleanor explained, her eyes twinkling with delight at the reunion unfolding in her hospital room. This extraordinary convergence of lives caught the attention of a junior reporter who happened to be at the hospital covering a charity event. Within days, headlines appeared: "Hollywood's kindest hearts, Bullock and Reeves befriend waiter who insulted them. The story quickly went viral, though with significant inaccuracies and sensationalism. Sandra and Keanu found themselves fielding questions about the incident during previously scheduled press junkets. Rather than feed the media frenzy, they consistently redirected attention to the hospital's cancer support programs and the financial challenges facing families of patients. The real story isn't about a celebrity encounter, Keanu told one persistent interviewer. It's about how easy it is to judge someone without knowing their struggles. We're all fighting battles others know nothing about. The publicity, though unwanted, had an unexpected benefit. Donations to Providence St. John's Cancer Support Fund quadrupled in the weeks following the story's circulation. Several of Sandra's and Keanu's industry contacts reached out privately, offering to help with Eleanor's medical expenses. Meanwhile, Thomas returned to work at Bellini's, noticeably transformed. The edge of bitterness had softened, replaced by a quiet humility and gratitude that customers and coworkers quickly noticed. What no one at the restaurant realized was that Thomas now spent his mornings at the hospital with his mother, often joined by either Sandra or Keanu, forming an unlikely friendship built on vulnerability and second chances. It was during one of these morning visits that Eleanor's doctor arrived with unexpected news that would change everything once again. The treatment is working, Dr. Patel announced, reviewing Eleanor's latest scan results with cautious optimism. The tumor has reduced by almost 30%. It's not remission, but it's a significant improvement. The room filled with a fragile hope. Thomas clutched his mother's hand, too overwhelmed to speak. Eleanor, who had made peace with her prognosis months ago, looked stunned by this unexpected reprieve. What changed? She asked softly. Dr. Patel explained that Eleanor had been enrolled in an experimental treatment program, one with limited spots, that typically had a waiting list of months. Somehow, her application had been expedited. What the doctor didn't mention was that Sandra's quiet influence had helped navigate the bureaucratic hurdles, not through celebrity privilege, but through persistent advocacy and connecting Eleanor with the right specialists. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor grew stronger. Though she wasn't cured, the additional time was a gift beyond measure. Thomas reduced his double shifts, prioritizing quality time with his mother during this precious extension. The restaurant incident that had brought them all together faded from public interest, but the bonds formed remained. Sandra occasionally stopped by Bellini's, always requesting Thomas as her server, a private joke between them that helped rewrite their initial encounter. Keanu continued his hospital visits long after the media spotlight moved elsewhere, often bringing books of poetry that he and Eleanor would discuss for hours. 6 months after their first meeting, Thomas invited Sandra and Keanu to a small gathering at his apartment. Eleanor was having a good day, one of many recently, and wanted to cook dinner for the people who had become like family. I have something to tell you all, Thomas announced as they sat around his modest dining table. I've decided to go back to school. I'm enrolling in the nursing program at the community college. Eleanor beamed with pride. He starts next semester. Your experiences inspired me, Thomas explained, looking at Sandra and Keanu. I watched how the nurses cared for my mom, how they restored dignity during her most vulnerable moments. And I saw how you both showed me compassion when I deserved none. He paused, emotion catching in his throat. I want to be that person for someone else. Sandra raised her glass in a toast. To new beginnings. And to the lessons we learn in unexpected places, Keanu added. Later that evening, as Eleanor rested and the three continued their conversation on Thomas's small balcony, Sandra reflected on their unlikely friendship. You know, in my industry, we're taught to create these perfect personas. To hide our struggles. But it's our vulnerabilities that actually connect us. Thomas nodded. I judged you based on an image, not as a person with your own challenges and pain. I'll never make that mistake again. The world sees what it wants to see, Keanu said quietly. But kindness lets us see each other clearly. A year later, Thomas graduated at the top of his nursing class. Eleanor, now in remission against all odds, sat in the front row alongside Sandra and Keanu, who had attended without publicity or fanfare, just as friends supporting a friend. Thomas now works in the oncology ward where his mother once received treatment. Patients often comment on his extraordinary empathy and patience, never knowing the journey that led him there. Sandra and Keanu remain connected to the family, their friendship a private treasure untouched by Hollywood spotlight. The incident at Bellini's restaurant taught them all that life's most profound connections often begin in moments of conflict, that judgments made in haste miss the complex humanity behind each face, and that grace extended in difficult moments can transform not just a single interaction but entire lives. As Eleanor likes to say whenever she shares their story with new friends, sometimes our worst moments lead us to our best selves, if we're brave enough to learn from them.